For years, my husband thought he was the clever one. He'd smile at dinner parties, tell little jokes about me. My wife, bless her heart, she's got no sense for taste or timing, and everyone would laugh. Even I did at first. It was easier than showing the hurt, but behind those smiles, I learned something. Every cruel word can be folded into silence, and silence has a way of teaching louder lessons than rage ever could. I'm Clara, and this is the story of how I let the man who mocked me fall deeply, helplessly in love with the woman I pretended to be. Before we go on, if you enjoy calm, emotional stories about love, betrayal, and quiet revenge, don't forget to like this video, leave your thoughts below, and subscribe for more real-life inspired tales that linger in the heart. It began years ago in a small house that smelled like burnt coffee and ambition. My husband Daniel was charming when he wanted to be, but charm has its limits when paired with contempt. He loved being seen as superior, the clever husband, the witty one, the man everyone respected. I was just the soft background to his brightness. He'd mock my handwriting when I wrote him notes. He'd roll his eyes when I mispronounced a word. And once, when I told him I wanted to start a small business, he laughed for a full minute before saying, "Sweetheart, you can't even finish a crossword. What makes you think you can run anything?" That night, I didn't argue. I just watched him laugh. And in the quiet after, something inside me shifted. It wasn't anger, not really. More like understanding. I understood that I had been giving him too much of myself, honesty, vulnerability, sincerity, to someone who only saw those as flaws. So I stopped giving. Instead, I began studying. It started small, noticing what kind of woman he admired in others. The poised ones, the witty ones who could spar with him in conversation, who always seemed interesting. I watched how he'd lean forward when certain women spoke, how his eyes softened when they smiled with a mystery he couldn't quite read. I didn't envy them, I learned from them. If he couldn't see my worth as I was, I'd let him fall for the version of me he believed deserved it, so I began to build her. At first it was subtle. I started reading what he read. Philosophy, economics, even those dry political memoirs he claimed expanded the mind. I didn't do it for him, though. I wanted to understand the language he used to keep me small. I learned it quietly, slowly, patiently. And then, one evening, when he came home bragging about a debate he'd had at work, I offered an opinion sharp, unexpected, measured. He looked at me as if he'd never really seen me before. "When did you start thinking like that?" he asked, half laughing. I smiled. "Maybe I always did. You just never asked." That was the first crack in his confidence. Soon, he started noticing things the way I carried myself, the calmness in my tone, how I no longer sought his approval. He began to linger near me when I read, to ask my thoughts on things he once assumed I couldn't understand. He didn't know it then, but the woman sitting across from him wasn't his wife anymore, not the version he thought he'd broken. She was a creation born from his underestimation. But love built on arrogance is a fragile thing. And when that arrogance begins to crumble, it doesn't take long before obsession grows in its place. It began with the smallest gestures, the ones I once craved and had long stopped expecting. Daniel would linger in the doorway when I was reading, pretending to be lost in thought. He'd pour me a glass of wine without being asked, set it by my side, and wait for me to look up. When I didn't, he'd clear his throat softly, a sound so unfamiliar coming from him that it almost made me laugh. The man who used to dismiss my every word now seemed desperate to hear them. At first, I played my part quietly. I wasn't cruel, not outwardly. I listened, nodded, smiled when it was expected. I let him talk, let him think he was rediscovering me. In truth, I was studying him the way one studies a foreign language, learning every inflection, every pause, every insecurity he thought he'd hidden. He'd say things like, "You've changed, Clara. There's something different about you." And I'd reply softly, "Maybe I just stopped trying to be who you wanted me to be." He would frown then, uneasy. Because for a man like Daniel, control wasn't just a habit, it was oxygen. And suddenly, I wasn't giving him air. As weeks passed, he began asking about my days, my thoughts, my dreams. The same man who once mocked my ideas now sat across from me, like a student seeking a teacher's approval. But here's the thing about transformation. Once you start living as the person you were meant to be, it becomes almost impossible to pretend you were ever anyone else. And the woman I pretended to be for him, she was everything I had always been, just quieter, waiting beneath the noise of his ridicule. One evening, we were invited to a dinner party, the kind he used to love, full of polished laughter and subtle cruelty. I dressed simply, in a dark silk dress that made no effort to dazzle. But when I entered the room, every head turned, not because of the dress, but because of how I carried myself. Calm, certain, unreachable. I saw it in Daniel's face the moment he realized I was no longer a reflection orbiting his light. I was the light. Throughout the evening, I engaged in conversations that flowed with quiet intelligence. I smiled at his colleagues, held my own in debates he would have once dominated. And when one of them turned to him and said, "Daniel, your wife's brilliant, how lucky you are," I saw his pride twist into confusion, because he hadn't built this version of me. He had broken me, and from those fractures, I had rebuilt myself into someone he couldn't understand. When we got home, he watched me for a long time, as if searching for the woman he used to mock. She's gone, I thought, and you'll never meet her again. That night, as rain tapped against the window, Daniel finally said it. "I think I've fallen in love with you again." I didn't look at him. I didn't smile. I simply replied, "You've fallen in love with the woman you never cared to see." He didn't answer. He couldn't. The truth has a way of silencing even the most talkative. From that night on, something shifted between us, not in the way he wanted. He became gentler, almost timid, as though afraid that one wrong word might shatter the fragile connection he thought we'd rebuilt. But what he didn't understand was that I hadn't rebuilt anything. I had moved on long before he realized what he'd lost. The woman he now adored was an echo, a reflection I had crafted from everything he once mocked. And watching him fall for her was the quietest revenge I could have ever imagined. Because true revenge isn't loud. It isn't cruel. It's standing in the same room with the person who tried to diminish you and seeing in their eyes the realization that they no longer have the power to touch you. A few months later, Daniel tried to take me on a trip, some attempt at rekindling what never truly existed. I went, not out of hope, but closure. On the last night, he took my hand across the candlelit table and said, "I'm sorry, Clara, for the things I said, the way I treated you. I didn't know you had this in you." I looked at him, really looked. The man who once found joy in my humiliation now sat trembling, unsure of his place beside me, and I said, "That's the saddest part, Daniel. I always had it in me. You just never looked close enough to see." He blinked, as if realizing the finality of it all. For years I had begged for his validation. That night, he begged for mine. When we returned home, I packed my things, quietly, peacefully. He didn't stop me, perhaps, because some part of him understood that this wasn't punishment. It was freedom. I left behind the house that echoed with laughter at my expense. I left behind the woman who once doubted her worth. And as I drove away, I smiled not out of triumph, but relief. Because the best kind of revenge isn't destruction, it's evolution. Daniel never loved me until it was too late, and I never stopped loving the version of myself that waited patiently behind the silence to be seen. Now, when I look back, I don't think of him with anger. I think of him as a teacher, a cruel one, but a teacher nonetheless, because from his mockery, I learned something invaluable, that sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do is stop explaining herself and let the world or the man who underestimated her discover what they lost only when she no longer needs to be found. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe for more calm, emotional stories, the kind that remind us that silence, strength, and self-worth are sometimes the most beautiful forms of revenge.